Hello, everybody. Hope you all are doing well. This is going to be our recording for the 22nd of January. Let me pull up the right screen there. There it is. So we will be talking about quantitative research today. So we're going to give the overview of what actually is quantitative research, and then next class period, the 24th, we're going to go over what is qualitative research. Then we can answer questions about both when we meet together. And just want to remind everyone too that our quantitative research article summary assignment is actually due um, on this Sunday. Sunday should be, let's see, the 26th should be the due date on that. So Sunday the 26th is due our first assignment, which is our quantitative research article summary assignment. So let me know if you have any questions about that. But otherwise, we will continue on with today. So let's talk about it. Again, get SPSS set up on your computer because we're going to need that for this quantitative unit, especially when we get into actually practicing and doing some computations and all the analyses and that fun stuff. You're going to need SPSS downloaded. So if you have any issue, reach out to Concordia's IT. They have the code and everything to set up for your computer. So make sure you get that set up. If you have questions like, well, what if I can't get it set up on my personal computer? Where on campus can I get access to it? Like computer labs, that will be available to you. So just let me know of any questions you have around that. All right. Quantitative research. What actually is quantitative research? So when you think of quantitative research, think about numerical data, whereas qualitative research is going to be non-numerical data. We're going to talk about what that looks like. Think of quantitative research as your traditional statistics, as the math, as the numerical data side of things. So quantitative research is the process of collecting and analyzing numerical data to understand the social world. Again, we're in the social side of this. We're in sociology. And the goals of quantitative research could be anywhere from identifying patterns and averages and means, making predictions, testing correlational or causal relationships, generalizing findings effectively to larger populations. These are the types of goals that you will have in quantitative research. And why is it important? So quantitative research helps us to gain obviously greater knowledge of social phenomena. I mean, that's one of our main principles of social research in and of itself, but that's a part of quantitative research. Also producing objective data communicated through things like statistics, through numbers. That's the purpose of quantitative research. And then using a systematic scientific process that allows studies in quantitative research to be replicated, to be verified. You can collect some data and you can do analyses on that data. And then I can do analyses on that data. I can replicate the study that you've completed by using the data that you have, or vice versa. Or we both looking independently at another person's data. That's a really powerful use of quantitative research. And it's really good for, I mentioned, right, the finding patterns and averages. So tracking trends and employment rates over time, making prediction, maybe forecasting election outcomes based upon polling data, testing causal relationships, whether that could be investigating whether access to education reduces inequality and showing maybe policymakers that here's a causal or correlational relationship here. Generalizing results, so applying findings maybe from a survey sample to a larger national population. Again, polling is another example of that. So all these sorts of things go into why quantitative research is important. And it's essential, quantitative research is essential for creating reliable, replicable knowledge about the social world, especially when we need to analyze those numerical trends or relationships systematically. So whether it's longitudinally or cross-sectionally, remember we talked about that in the last class period, whether it's cross-sectionally and looking at data at this period of time, or longitudinally looking at data, the same sets of data or samples over time. Quantitative relationship helps us to look at these things systematically in reliable, replicable ways. That's really powerful. So let's talk about some various types of quantitative research. So there are a lot of types to quantitative research, but I'm just going to describe a few quick ones here. So descriptive, correlational, experimental, and comparative. So descriptive research. The purpose here is to summarize and describe the current status or circumstances of maybe the specific variables being studied. So focusing on the what. Descriptive is the what is happening. The key features here, there's no real hypotheses at the start. Maybe they can emerge after data collection, but the variables are not manipulated. We're just describing what's happening. So does not use the law of probability. A common example could be like large-scale surveys into a population we don't know a whole lot about. So to ask yourself in descriptive knowledge, what does the data say about the current situation? Again, it's the what. Descriptive is the what. Correlational research, the purpose here is to investigate relationships between variables. We'll get into more of what positive, maybe versus a negative relationship looks like in correlations, but here it's identifying trends and patterns, but not necessarily causation. Variables are measured here and recorded, again, but not manipulated. The designs here, again, just looking at relationships, maybe making predictions about those relationships. An example could be looking at the relationship between exercise and mental health. Are they correlated? If you exercise more often, on average, do folks have better mental health outcomes? Those are the sorts of things we can look at in correlational research. What you want to be asking yourself in correlational research, are these variables connected and how strongly are they connected? Don't worry if you don't know how to actually answer those questions, because we're going to get into that in later sessions about measuring effectiveness and measuring how related variables are and how strong those relationships are. Experimental research here is to identify cause and effect relationships. That is the goal here. So the key features is that you as the researcher actually manipulate an independent variable to observe its effect on a dependent variable. So we mentioned the kind of different research designs like experimental research designs before, but this is really common in sociology and psychology and the other sort of medical sciences. Example here, like testing the effect of a new teaching method on student performance. So maybe you're an educator and you're teaching 228 classes, and you're going to use one method here and one method in another class. You're manipulating the independent variable, looking at the dependent variable, which is student performance. So the things you want to be asking yourself here is, does changing one variable cause the change in another, right? You manipulating the independent variable, is that causing actually a change in another? Comparative research. Here, the purpose of comparative research is to compare pre-existing groups to study the effects of an independent variable. So there's no random selection. There's active manipulation in this research. There's no active manipulation, and there's no control group either. So you often involves archival data. So looking at data that's pre-existing, common design like pre and post tests, which we'll talk a little bit more about, are an example of comparative research. Looking at, okay, here's the impacts of this variable on this population versus the impacts of this variable. What are the different outcomes that we're observing? So examples could be comparing mean scores across different demographic groups, or testing interventions in health and organizational settings. Examples of comparative research. The question you'll ask yourself here is, how do these groups differ based on the variables of interest? So maybe how do academic student scores differ at Concordia based upon what hall you live in as freshmen students, or maybe the differences in white versus non-white students. These are examples of what comparative research can do. There's some shared features in correlational and experimental research I just want to hit on. One is you can formally test hypotheses using those statistical methods, and then results can be generalized more depending on the sampling method. So those are the different types of quantitative research I just wanted to have us cover at this time, but we'll get into each of these more throughout the unit. Steps in quantitative research design. So it's structured around the scientific method. Remember, we talked about the scientific method and what that goes into. And in sociology being a science, social science, we use the scientific method and that we're structured around it. So quantitative research uses structured processes and numerical data to test hypotheses. Using this, we employ deductive reasoning to confirm or reject predictions. That's kind of the idea here in quantitative research, what it revolves around. So some key steps here. Number one, make observations. So identify a phenomenon, identify a problem or a trend that is unknown or unexplained that you want to learn more about. Two, investigate theories around that. So review the current literature or the theories related to the issue that you're looking into. What is the prevailing knowledge or hypotheses there? Formulate your hypothesis. So develop a testable statement based upon your observations. I've observed this. about my topic of choice, my area of choice. Here's what I predict that is going to result from my research, the findings. Predict outcome. So specify what the data should reveal if the hypothesis is true and create a plan to test those predictions. This is a step that's often neglected in student research because you think 3 and 4 often go together. Well, you got to formulate your hypothesis. So I predict that, let's say if, taking the example before that, I'm teaching 2 different Social 28 classes and I say, well, I think that an in-person or a hybrid, an in-person model is going to produce greater student outcome, greater academic achievement for students in that course. Well, then the number 4 is not just saying that, okay, I predicted that outcome, but predicting how that outcome is measured. So whether it's through a survey at the end of class and you're asking these questions and that scores are going to be higher that way, or looking at final grades in that course, you have to identify, okay, you're predicting your hypothesis, but how are we actually examining that hypothesis? So that's number 4. And then 5, collect and process the data, gather your data using appropriate methods, and then analyze and conclude. So if confirmed, you verify those results, draw your conclusions, present your findings. If your hypothesis is not confirmed, adjust your hypothesis based upon your findings, and then restart that process. So identify, hey, we looked at the data, and actually my hypothesis is incorrect, and then go back and how can we figure out what is actually going on here then, and repeat this process. Methods in quantitative research. So there's going to be some, 4 key areas here. So experiment, survey, systematic observation, and then secondary research. So methods are how we're actually going about finding or gathering this data. So experiment. So how to use an experiment. This is where, again, you're controlling or manipulating an independent variable to measure the effects on a dependent variable. So an example could be to test whether an intervention reduces procrastination among college students. One group receives the intervention while the other group of college students performs a comparable task. Afterwards, compare self-ratings of procrastination behaviors between those 2 groups. So you're looking at 2 groups, but you're introducing an intervention. I mean, you're introducing maybe a method to reduce procrastination among a certain group of students, and then looking at the difference in procrastination outcomes, maybe self-surveys there. 2, survey. So how to distribute questionnaires or conduct survey interviews to gather data from a target group. Maybe you're surveying first-year international students using rating scales to understand their experiences with things like culture shock or educational attainment. Surveys are one of the most widely used methods in quantitative research. We're going to talk about surveys a lot, and you're actually going to do a survey construction assignment in this course. Systematic observation. So this is where you observe and record behaviors in their natural setting, natural setting, ensuring that data collection follows a structured format. So maybe to study classroom participation, observe and record active or passive behaviors from students from different backgrounds, maybe in quantifying really their prevalence. So looking at, maybe you identify certain patterns of behavior you want to look at. How many people check their phones in class? How many people start falling asleep in class? And quantify how many times you see that. Secondary research. This is where you're analyzing existing data or documents collected for other purposes. So maybe it's using longitudinal studies to assess changes in climate change attitudes since the 1980s. Or reanalyzing data from a previous study to explore new questions about that data. Maybe they use these statistical analyses on the data, and you're like, well, I want to see if we used these other analyses, or look at different relationships between different variables that they didn't look at. Or maybe even conducting a content analysis of articles to study the prevalence of certain themes that you're looking for over time. So maybe look at 100 popular journal articles from 1980 to look at the assessment of attitudes towards that election and how that changed over the course of 12 months in 1980. Who knows? But these are the sorts of secondary research where it's data that's already been collected, but you're doing something new with it. All right. And then examples of quantitative research questions. So I'll just go through a couple of these. You'll see in the notes that you can actually look through each of these, and please do that. But here's some examples of potential research questions in quantitative research. And I want to identify the variables, population, and potential samples of each of those. So, for example, and remember, what do we mean by variables, population, and sample? So a variable is what is actually being measured, right? Is it how much fast food do Americans consume per week? So how much fast food is actually being consumed is a variable there. A population, who is actually being studied, and then a sample is a subset of that population. So if my population is American adults 18 to 65, I need to find a representative sample of that group. Maybe it's instead of obviously millions and millions and hundreds of millions of Americans in that group, I'm going to look at 10,000 or 1,000 or 500 to be representative of that greater population, a random sample of that. So let's go through the first two. That first question, how much fast food do Americans consume per week? Well, a variable could be your fast food consumption, so the frequency or the quantity of fast food consumption per week in your population or sample. Your population are Americans. And then your sample could be adults in the US surveyed online or in person to look at their fast food intake per week. So see how your sample, your population are all Americans, and that you're never going to be able to survey every single American, but your sample can be representative or as representative as possible of that population. So adults in the US survey, for instance. Let's go with the second question too. How often do students between the ages of 15 to 18 use Facebook weekly? I understand Facebook is kind of like the old person thing. I understand that. But for the example here, see how often students between 15 and 18 use Facebook weekly. So your variable there is weekly Facebook usage. So maybe it's the number of logins per week. Maybe it's the amount of hours they're on per week, the amount of minutes. Those are the types of variables you'd be looking at. Whereas population would be students aged 15 to 18. Well, what could be a potential sample for those for that population of students aged 15 to 18? Maybe it's high school students in a specific state or high school students nationwide with a random sample. So you send the survey out to thousands and thousands of students, 15 to 18 randomly, and you get a certain sample of that population that actually take that survey. And you can look at different demographics to make it more representative as well. Anyway, so you get the idea of, okay, variables are what we're studying. Population is who is being studied, and a sample is a feasible subset of that population that you can actually study and actually identify. And we'll talk about in the class what makes a randomized representative sample versus non-representative or randomized sample. And again, look in the notes there as well, as you can find specifics on each of these questions too, where you kind of practice with each of these. And just a couple of quick notes as well, that sampling matters too. We'll talk more about it, but ensure that your sample represents the population as best as possible. And then we'll talk more about randomized sampling as well. So I think it's also important to talk about quantitative research bias and the bias that you might be able to identify and maybe in certain studies or with other students or try to limit in your own study. So information, well, first of all, what is research bias, right? We've probably maybe heard a little bit about it, but bias in research occurs when the research itself, when systematic error is introduced at any stage. Systematic error is the key word there. So whether that's from study design to data collection to the analysis or to publication, bias can lead to inaccurate or misleading results by favoring certain outcomes versus the other. So think of systematic error favoring certain outcomes in your research over others. So some bias can be purposeful, where folks are purposely trying to have some bias in their research, where they're trying to maybe fudge some results. Others can be non-purposeful, obviously, where it's just something you overlook in a study. That's why methods are so important. So types of research bias. Number one, information bias. This occurs when key study variables are incorrectly measured or classified. It can arise in observational or experimental studies due to systematic difference in how you're actually collecting that data across survey groups. Let's say if I'm information bias, let's say I'm trying to study social media use, but I'm actually not correctly analyzing how to actually find that out. So if I'm wanting to understand how much students are on all social media platforms, but I neglect to include a question, or I neglect to study Twitter or Instagram use, well, then we're leaving out a key platform that could be studied there that should be included in that sort of variable. Omitted variable bias. So this happens when a statistical model leaves out one or more important variables. So this results in incomplete analysis, potentially misleading conclusions. You want to make sure that you're studying important variables as part of your research. Sampling bias. This occurs when some members of a certain population are systematically more likely to be included in the sample than others. So this is commonly referred to as ascertainment bias in oftentimes in medical research. So if white people, if I'm looking at Americans as my population, if white folks are more likely to be included in the sample than others and more weighted towards that, then it's not randomized, it's not representative. So we have to make sure that we're looking at what is considered to be representative sample and make sure that no certain populations are more or less likely to be included. Selection bias. This happens when research bias is introduced through participant selection, sampling methods, or recruitment strategies. Kind of more of an umbrella term that also includes sampling bias. But this can just distort a study's results if the sample is not representative of the population, also known as the selection effect is what it's called. So a couple just key points here is that bias can be minimized through careful study design, through random sampling, and through data validation processes. Each of those things we're going to talk through more and more in the course. Awareness of these types of biases, though, helps researchers like you, like me, to interpret findings more accurately and critically, to have a critical eye on studies maybe we see and make sure that, hey, was there bias involved? How can we identify if bias was involved? So, quantitative data analysis. So there's different types of statistical analyses that we're going to talk about in this class. So just to start up, processing data. So before analyzing your data, you need to process it. And you're going to do this for a couple of your assignments. So an example, so survey responses or test data might need to be transformed from words into more numerical codes. And you're thinking, well, how, let's say, for example, if I ask a survey question and I say, rank your level of agreement with the following statement. Concordia's IT department is extremely helpful. I'm sure they are. I'm just using an example. So Concordia's IT department is helpful. And the question answers are strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, and strongly disagree. And you select agree or strongly agree or disagree, whatever it might be. You're saying, well, how does that become numerical data? Well, you code that. So maybe you're looking at mean scores and you rank strongly agree a 5, strongly disagree a 1, and the others in between. So you're able to get the higher the mean, the more people then generally agree with that statement. That's what I mean by processing the data. So we do back-end coding. Again, we'll explore that further during the survey construction discussion later, but that's how we get to that numerical data side. So you need to process your data first, and then types of statistical analyses. Descriptive statistics, number one. This is a big focus of this class. Because it's more of an introduction to methods and statistics, we're going to be primarily talking about descriptive statistics. This is where you summarize your data to understand key characteristics. So this includes measures of averages, your mean, median, mode, variability, your range, your standard deviation, again, variance, we'll get into all these things. And looking at demographics, descriptive statistics, that's a big one as well. Visualization tools, you're going to use graphs and scatter plots, frequency tables, all these things you're going to learn about. That's in descriptive statistics. The uses of descriptive statistics are to identify trends or outliers, gaining an initial understanding of your data, face value understanding of your data. Descriptive statistics are just that you're describing something that you're finding out about. You're describing the data. That's what we're doing there. An average or an example would be like the average test scores of students in a class. That would be an example of you're describing, well, what is the average test score? You're describing that. And again, I mentioned this is going to be a big focus of this class, but we're going to learn how to calculate descriptive statistics. You're going to understand the meaning and practical applications, how to describe them, develop skills to actually communicate those findings. So you're going to figure out how to do this. You're going to understand what it all means, what the results actually mean of descriptive statistics, and then how to actually communicate statistical findings in that way. Number two, which we will talk about, but you're going to get more practice on the descriptive side. Number two is inferential statistics. These allow you to make predictions or generalize your inferring from your data from your sample data to a larger population. So your key goals of inferential statistics are testing hypotheses, are estimating population parameters, things like that. And remember, this is where you are inferring. It's in the word. You're inferring predictions or generalizations. So an example would be maybe using survey data from 200 students to predict satisfaction across the entire university. If you maybe you can't sample the entire university, right? At Concordia, maybe we could, 2,000 to 3,000 students. But at maybe the University of Minnesota, where you got 60, 70,000 students, it's going to be much harder to get a representative, to get a wide sample there across the population. So maybe we survey 200 to 500 of those students and make inferences based upon that sample. Key points here, again, so think about why processing data is important. We're going to get to that. Think about how descriptive statistics provide insight to your research. What do means, meanings, and modes actually tell us? And then how would you use inferential statistics and what might be the limitations there? Have those questions in the back of your head. Advantages of quantitative research. Just we've talked a little bit about this, but think about some strengths here. Think about what could those strengths be? Test yourself quick. Maybe pause the recording and test yourself for a second. 3, 2, 1. Maybe you didn't pause. Maybe you did. It's fine. Think about maybe these 4 key benefits here. So replication. Quantitative research allows us to repeat a study, the possibility there because of the standardized data collection protocols, the tangible definitions of abstract concepts. It allows for replication, wide-scale replication as well. Direct comparison of results. So this studies how they can be reproduced in other cultural settings, times, or with different groups of participants. Results can be compared statistically around those things. Large samples. So data from large samples can be processed and analyzed using reliable and consistent procedures through quantitative data analysis. It's a lot easier to analyze quantitative data from 1,000 people than it is qualitative data from 1,000 people because of the numerical nature of it. Hypothesis testing as well. So using formalized and established hypothesis testing procedures means that you have to carefully consider and report your research variables. But what that allows us to do, we can actually test those hypotheses effectively and replicate in a repeat way, and other people can replicate those hypothesis testing with quantitative research. And we could do so before even creating a conclusion, right? We can collaborate and people all around without geographical differences or whatever it might be, can look into that data, right? Can do the same tests on the data that you've collected. Disadvantages of quantitative research. What do you think? What might be some disadvantages of quantitative research? I have 4 here to talk about just really quickly. Superficiality. Using precise and restrictive operational definitions. This may inadequately represent complex concepts. For example, the concept of mood may be represented with just a number in quantitative research, but explained with more elaboration in qualitative research. So you're limited in how you can actually describe these things because you're narrowing down to numerical codes. You have some limit in how you can dive into the data. Narrow focus. So predetermined variables and measurement procedures can mean that you ignore maybe potential other relevant observations. You don't know what you don't know because you're just surveying based upon the tools that you've created. Structural bias. So despite standardized procedures, structural biases can still affect quantitative research. So missing data, imprecise measurements, or inappropriate sampling methods are all biases that can lead to wrong conclusions. And then a lack of context. Quantitative research often uses unnatural settings like laboratories or even fails to consider historical or cultural context that may affect data collection and results. Whereas qualitative research, think about like having a conversation about a topic. You can go in certain different directions, right? Quantitative research, you're more limited in what actually you have built into, say, a survey, for example. All right, when to use quantitative research. So there's a lot of times when to use quantitative research. Key situations to maybe be considered of large groups. So quantitative research is ideal for collecting data from a large and diverse group of respondents. For example, surveys or polls conducted across multiple regions or multiple demographics across the country. Quantitative research is more effective in a very large sample size. Receptive audiences as well. So this is effective when your audience prefers results presented as things like facts, graphs, charts, or statistics. If you're looking to present to maybe policymakers, those sort of hard-nosed statistics can be really important for helping people understand and buy into an issue. So example of different audiences that this might be useful for, maybe organizational leaders looking at employee satisfaction results, or senior cabinets, business or economic analyses, versus departments like maybe human resources, which may favor those qualitative insights, or you're writing a book, or maybe you prefer qualitative insights, right? And we're going to talk about how you combine these quantitative and qualitative insights to make it even more effective across the board. But these are the types of audiences that maybe might prefer quantitative research over qualitative. And there's a lot of applications across disciplines when it comes to quantitative research. So quantitative research is used widely in fields, and I'm sure you've seen it already getting to this point in your academic career. The social sciences, obviously, we're talking obviously about sociology and the social sciences, but psychology, public health, political science, all these social sciences use quantitative research widely. Other fields like education, economics, marketing, healthcare, you're going to see in the real world, you're going to see quantitative research all the time. If you're a business major, if you're a psych major, if you're a history major, whatever it is, you're going to see it across the board. And when to choose quantitative data. So use quantitative research when your study seeks to maybe assess a problem or answer questions like the what or the how many, those sorts of questions. You want to understand the relationship between an independent variable and one or more dependent variables. Or maybe if you want to provide objective insights to shed light on key research areas. These are reasons why you would want to choose quantitative research. Some guiding principles. Before you select quantitative research, you want to review your research goals. You want to consider the claims you hope to make. And you want to ask yourself, does quantitative data align with your study's purpose and audience needs? If I want to describe really in depth the experience of 15 students at Concordia, maybe qualitative research is going to be better because I can maybe have conversations, interview, focus groups. That's going to be really important to describe. But if I want to look at the relationship between income and maybe health outcomes in the United States, that those hard-nosed statistics across a wide group and a wide population is going to be more effectively done through quantitative research. Hopefully those differences are clear there. And if you have questions, obviously reach out to me. And we'll discuss more about these when we meet in person. Another reminder though, please make sure to get your assignment done where you make sure you set up SPSS on your computer. It's going to be really, really important to do so. Also, make sure that you're thinking about your quantitative research article summary assignment because that is due this coming Sunday, by the end of Sunday on January 26th. If you need any help with that assignment, I am here. Please let me know. Of course, at any time you have questions, you can just reach out to me or add something to a discussion board in Moodle. All right, everybody. Appreciate the time today. We'll see you soon.